Every guitarist you have ever loved learned the same lesson. You change chords. You move from one to the next. That movement is what music is made of. John Lee Hooker spent 50 years ignoring that lesson. He would sit down, find one chord, one groove, one hypnotic rolling boogie, and he would stay there for 4 minutes, for 6 minutes, for as long as he felt like it. And it was some of the most powerful music ever recorded. They called him the king of the boogie. Not the boogie-woogie of the piano players, something older, deeper, stranger, a driving, foot-stomping, one-chord groove that came up out of the Mississippi ground and never let go. B.B. King said it plainly. When they say true blues, pure blues, John Lee Hooker is as close to it as anyone I've ever heard. He could not read music. He never had a single music lesson in his life. His first instrument was an inner tube from a tire, nailed to a barn door that he would pluck for the sound. He kept time not with a metronome, but with his own foot stamping on the floorboards, and that stamp is on the records. You can hear it, a man keeping time with his own body because he trusted nothing else. His songs broke every rule. They did not have the right number of bars. They did not change key when they were supposed to. Session musicians who tried to play with him were baffled. He would change the length of a line whenever the feeling moved him, and you simply had to follow. "I don't play in time," he once said. "I play in feeling." And that feeling conquered the world. Boogie Chillen, boom boom. One bourbon, one scotch, one beer. Crawling King Snake, Dimples. Songs that the Rolling Stones covered, that ZZ Top built a career on, that Bruce Springsteen and Bonnie Raitt and Carlos Santana all bowed down to. The Doors, Canned Heat, George Thorogood. All of them were carrying John Lee Hooker's one chord into the future. Here is the question this whole story turns on. How does a man who plays only one chord end up teaching the entire world how to feel the blues? John Lee Hooker was born today in 1917. Let's find out how he did it. John Lee Hooker was born on August 22, 1917, near Clarksdale, Mississippi, the exact patch of Delta Earth that people call the birthplace of the blues. His father was a sharecropper and a Baptist preacher, and the only music allowed in the house was gospel. The blues was the devil's music. It was forbidden. But his mother remarried, and his stepfather was a man named William Moore, a blues guitarist who had known Charlie Patton and Blind Lemon Jefferson, the founding giants of the form. Moore sat the boy down and taught him, and he did not teach him to play like everyone else. He taught him a personal, hypnotic, droning style, the specific rolling boogie that John Lee Hooker would carry, unchanged, for the rest of his life. Every note Hooker ever played came from that stepfather's hands. Mississippi was not a place a young black man could dream in. "Where I came from in Mississippi was hell," Hooker said later. He was barely a teenager when he ran. He walked and hitched his way to Memphis, to Beale Street, the beating heart of the blues, but he was too young for the clubs, so he played house parties in the boarding house where he stayed, for coins and for supper. From Memphis, he moved to Cincinnati, where he sang in gospel groups for years, keeping his blues a secret, singing the Lord's music in public and the devil's music in his head. He was building something in private that the world was not ready to hear. He was waiting without knowing he was waiting for a city big enough and loud enough to hold his sound. In 1943, he found it. He moved to Detroit, to a city roaring with wartime factory work, thick with black workers who had come up from the South just like him, and hungry every single night for music that sounded like home. He got a job as a janitor in an automobile plant, and in the evenings he plugged an electric guitar into an amplifier for the first time. A country boy from the Mississippi cotton fields walks into the loudest industrial city in America and picks up an electric guitar What do you think happened when that ancient Delta boogie met electricity for the very first time? In 1948, John Lee Hooker walked into a Detroit recording session and cut a song called Boogie Chillen. Just him, just an electric guitar run hot and distorted, and his own foot stamping the beat on the wooden floor. No band, no drummer, no rules. A single hypnotic chord rolling on, and his voice half singing, half talking a story over the top of it. It went to #1 on the R&B charts. A raw, primitive one-man recording, no polish, no band, a foot for a drum, became one of the biggest black records in America. It reportedly sold 1 million copies. People had never heard anything like it, because there had never been anything like it. It was the sound of the Delta plugged into the wall. And here the story takes a strange turn. Hooker had signed a contract that tied him to one label, but other labels wanted that sound. So he simply recorded for all of them, under fake names. He became Texas Slim. He became John Lee Booker, Delta John, Birmingham Sam, Johnny Williams, Little Pork Chops. One man wearing a dozen masks, flooding the market with his own voice. It was chaos, and it tells you exactly who he was. No piece of paper was going to tell him to stop. Then, in 1962, he wrote the song that would outlive everything. Boom Boom, a tight, swaggering, irresistible groove, born in a Detroit club called the Apex Bar, where a bartender named Luilla used to point at him every time he came in late and say, "Boom Boom, you're late again." He turned her teasing into one of the coolest songs ever recorded, later covered by the Animals, the Yardbirds, and inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. And across the ocean, something extraordinary was happening. In gray post-war England, a generation of young white boys had got hold of American blues records, and John Lee Hooker's were among the most treasured of all. The Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Yardbirds, they studied him like scripture. When they crossed the Atlantic and conquered America, they carried his name into every interview and handed him a young new audience that suddenly wanted to know who wrote these songs. A song built from a bartender scolding him for being late, and a room full of English teenagers treating his records like holy text. What is it about John Lee Hooker that turned the smallest ordinary moments into timeless music and made a whole new generation bow down? But the blues is a hard road, and fashion is cruel. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, public interest in the blues collapsed. The British boys had moved on. The folk crowd had scattered. John Lee Hooker, a living giant, a founding father of rock and roll itself, was back to playing small clubs for a few hundred people, with no record contract, remembered mostly by diehards. A man who taught the Rolling Stones how to play, reduced to small clubs, and no record deal in his late 60s. It would have been the end of almost anyone's story, but John Lee Hooker was about to do the most improbable thing of his entire life. In 1989, at 73 years old, he released an album called The Healer. The idea was simple: bring in all the famous younger musicians who worshipped him, and let each one record a track alongside the old master, Bonnie Raitt, Los Lobos, George Thorogood, and on the title track, a devoted lifelong disciple named Carlos Santana. It should have been a modest tribute record. Instead, it detonated. The Healer sold over 1 million copies. It became one of the best-selling blues albums of all time. And the duet with Bonnie Raitt on I'm in the Mood won John Lee Hooker a Grammy Award, his first ever at the age of 73, more than 40 years after Boogie Chillen. The man who had been playing small clubs for pocket money was suddenly, in his 70s, the most celebrated blues musician alive, and he did not stop. Mr. Lucky, chill out. Don't Look Back in 1997, which won him 2 more Grammys. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He had money, comfort, and honor at last. I had a good life and I had a rough life, he said. I've had both. He waited more than half a century for his greatest success, and it arrived when he was old enough to be most people's grandfather. What does it tell you about persistence, about staying exactly who you are, that the world finally came to him instead of the other way around? John Lee Hooker died on June 21, 2001 in Los Altos, California. He was in his 80s. He had performed almost until the very end, still touring, still recording, still stamping his foot on stages around the world. He died at home, peacefully, in his sleep. A rare and gentle ending for a man from his hard beginning. He left behind a catalog so vast that nobody has ever fully counted it. Hundreds of songs recorded across half a century, under his own name and a dozen invented ones. He left behind 4 Grammy Awards, almost all of them won after the age of 70. He left behind a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and near the top of every list of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. But the real inheritance is in the sound. Every time a rock band locks into a single hypnotic groove and rides it, that is John Lee Hooker. Every time a guitarist trusts feeling over the rulebook, that is John Lee Hooker. ZZ Top, The Doors, Springsteen, Santana, The White Stripes. The whole lineage of raw, hypnotic, one-chord American music runs straight back to a man stamping his foot in a Detroit studio in 1948. "Nobody know John Lee Hooker," he once said, with a smile. "They know as much about my cat as they know about me." The world knew the boogie. The world sang boom boom. But the quiet, cool, private man behind the sunglasses, the sharecropper's son who ran from Mississippi hell and refused for 84 years to play anyone's music but his own, stayed a little bit hidden. A mystery in a sharp hat. He was the last of the true Delta bluesmen. The living bridge between Charlie Patton and the Rolling Stones. The man who proved that you do not need to change chords or read music or follow the rules or chase fashion. You just need to find your one true feeling and stay there and play it until the whole world finally comes around. John Lee Hooker was born today in 1917, the king of the boogie, the hook. If a single chord played with total conviction can outlast every trend of 100 years, maybe the lesson is to stop changing and start feeling. John Lee Hooker. Say his name, subscribe. We do this every day.